We've all heard of Irish politicians whose grandparents and great-grandparents emigrated from Ireland and they became quite famous in their new country, should we say, like the Kennedys, who went over during the famine, produced J.F. Kennedy, President of America. Lots and lots of people went in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and indeed up to the 1880s. And there's a line in a great song. It's called The Reason I Left Mullingar, written by a fella, Pat Cooksey, who used to live in Dunmore East. And the line in the song is about a place in Cricklewood in North London where the Irish used to line up every morning. It was called the Broadway. They line up and prospective employers would come along and they say, you, and they jump into the cars, wagons, lorries, trucks, whatever, for a day's work. And the line in the song goes, "For every man that finds fortune and comes home to tell of the tale, each morning the Broadway is crowded with many the thousands who fail." And my talk tonight is about those many thousands who failed. Some of them were the most vulnerable in our society: young girls, young children, orphans. And their lives turned out to be a tragedy, one after the other. And the article will be going into Eigse, the historical journal, hopefully. And the article had its genesis in a proposed study of female emigration from Ireland in the 19th century. And as research progressed, the human faces of the stark emigration figures began to emerge. They emerged from the newspaper reports, from books, journals, and parliamentary reports. Their stories were upsetting, unsettling, and gave rise to anger. The figures were put aside and the lives of the tragic girls brought forward. The cold emigration statistics did not show the tear in the workhouse orphan's eye, nor the hopelessness and desperation of the pregnant workhouse girl. They did not show the fear of the 14-year-old orphan finding herself in a strange country, not knowing what was to become of her. Her only means of gaining sustenance was to sell her body. They did not show the racism endured by the immigrants, the anti-Catholic bias, nor the physical abuse or indeed the treatment they endured in the workhouse. This article attempts to humanise those cold emigration statistics. So where did it all begin? Well, on the 20th of July 1841, the Waterford Workhouse opened on John's Hill. It's the present St Patrick's Hospital. The first inmates amounted to 200 persons. They were essentially from the House of Industry, which is now the tax office in the Glen, and the other place was the Mendicity Asylum, which stood down in Railway Square. I came across a list of people in 1844, that's before the ravages of the famine took hold, and the list is from the Poor Law Commissioner's report of 1844. Most of those listed were not paupers, but some of the ordinary people of Waterford City and the surrounding district. In the list, there is almost an equal amount of desertions by wives as there are of husbands. Contrary to popular misconception that it was only beggars who went to the workhouse, the Poor Law report shows that only 18 inmates in the Waterford City Workhouse were classified as mendicants or professional beggars. The rest were described as shopkeepers, dealers, retail tradesmen, mechanics, handicraftsmen, and servants. Almost all of the applicants are described as being in rags. The list gives the name, ages, occupations, and physical condition on admission into the hospital. So in the workhouse, the list is absolutely shocking and makes very stark reading. And there we find Nellie Welch, aged 35, a Roman Catholic, mendicant, beggar. She was married, had been deserted by her husband, 4 children alive, admitted by the Board of Guardians on the 28th of March with her 3 children, almost naked and dirty. She was pregnant. Her present condition was in good health, young girl. The next person was John Golden, aged 40, again a Roman Catholic, labourer, married. He was deserted by his wife. Admitted by the Board of Guardians on the 18th of January, he was paralytic, brought in a cart in a dying state. He died on the 29th of February. Eileen Houlihan, aged 30, again Roman Catholic. She was a servant, a widow, admitted with her 2 children by the Board of Guardians on the 25th of January. She had dropsy, badly clothed, in bad health. She died on the 28th of January. Dennis Harrington, aged 64, Roman Catholic. He was a labourer. He was single. Admitted by the Board of Guardians on the 25th of January. Ill-clothed, rheumatic, died the 19th of March. You can see this was before the famine. Can you imagine after the ravages of the famine took hold in 1845, 1846, 1847, it kept going on and on and on. So in the workhouse, families would have been separated. The men would have gone to the men's quarters, the women to the women's quarters, the young boys to the boys, the young girls to the girls, and as only infants would have stayed for a period with their mothers. And life in the workhouse at any stage was not a very pleasant place to be. In March 1850, Waterford City Workhouse invited tenders for the construction of a capstan mill with 2 pairs of best French stone to be worked by manual labour. The capstan mill was not completed up in 1841, and we find that the tender had been given to a fellow called Benjamin Graham. Now, if you go around the town, city of Waterford, and you look at the shores on the roads, you will actually see that name, and those were made at his foundry. Early in 1851, the capstan mill was completed. It was described as being a very creditable piece of workmanship. It was made to accommodate 40 men, who, when walking in a ring of 60 feet at the rate of 2 miles per hour, and their expanded power would actually turn the millstones. Now, the millstones were essentially to grind corn. And I said originally it was intended that only men would work. We found very, very quickly that it wasn't only men. And in June 1851, we find on the local newspapers that the master of the Waterford Workhouse selected 60 of the strongest boys and putting them to work on the capstan mill. As time progressed, it appears that women were also put on the capstan mill. In August 1851, again we find on the local papers, a female inmate of the workhouse went to the police and charged the master of the workhouse with assault. The police attended a Board of Guardian meetings with the woman, and she told how the women, had been put on the capstan mill at 6 a.m. in the morning, and when they came back for their breakfast, all the milk was gone. The master came and instructed the women to return to the capstan mill. The women refused, saying they would not return to the capstan mill until they got milk. The master then twice assaulted the woman, and she went to the police to complain. The reward for the woman standing up for her rights was that it was recommended by the board that she be prosecuted for insubordination. And what of the young children? Well, this is an absolute terrible story, because the workhouse regime was devoid of any affection of tenderness shown towards their children. And probably due to a lack of intellectual stimulation, they became very unruly. Now, some of them stole bread, like an Oliver Twist, and what happened to them? Lots of boys for small little infringements, like stealing a piece of bread, selling rags through the windows where people would pass by, and they might tear up a sheet off the bed, and they would. And what happened to them? Young people, or young boys I should say, as young as the age of 10, were brought down to the penitentiary, that's the jail, on Hennessy's Road. And in that jail, there was a treadmill for adults, for men. Now, Oscar Wilde wrote of being put on the treadmill when he was in jail. I think it was Pentonville he was in. And he said it was the most mind-numbing thing he ever did in his life. Can you imagine that being felt by an adult? And yet these young little boys of 10, 12 and 14 were brought down and put on the treadmill. It was outrageous. Again, for little boys who in the bed, as lots of little boys and girls do, they wet the bed. They were brought down to the pump the next morning. They were stripped and publicly pumped on for a fault that they probably weren't even aware they were doing. Now, to get on to the Irish workhouse orphan girls. So the assault on the destitute class of Ireland was not only in the form of these draconian measures that I've already mentioned. It was decided that girls and women were the least productive in society and that they should be sent to Australia or North America or indeed to the United States and not be a burden on the ratepayers. It was found that 60 girls, having resided at an average of 10 years in Waterford Workhouse at an annual cost of £500. Here they would probably remain all their lives, since there is little or no hope of finding employment for them in the city. After having spent £5,000 on them, it appears to have struck the guardians that it would be not an irrational thing to do, but to send them to a place where their labour would provide them with a means of living. So they concluded that for £500 or a year's keep, the parish could send them to America where they'll find a welcome. And the newspaper report said why it would be cheaper for the Waterford ratepayers to pay the passage to Australia than to maintain them in idleness throughout their lives. Cheaper for the ratepayers and better for the girls. So what did they do? Well, they began to remove the orphans and the young children from Waterford workhouses and indeed from Irish workhouses. Now, in recent years, the emigration of orphan girls from Ireland has become quite topical. The research was essentially initiated mainly by the descendants of Irish orphan girls in Australia. Several excellent books have been written on the subject. Now, in the 1830s, young women, many of them both Irish and English, from foundling hospitals or houses of industry and other charitable institutions, were brought into New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. The aim of the British Imperial government, as Lord Howick, an English lord, put it, was to encourage the emigration of females to remedy what is a very serious evil in its present condition, that is, the disproportion of sexes. Quite simply, there was no women on Australia, loads of men and no women, so let's get a couple of biddies out there and that should sort it out. There was an enormous influx of Irish women as bounty immigrants into Australia in the 1840s. Between 1841 and 1842, almost 17,000 assisted Irish immigrants, now that's both men and women, arrived in New South Wales. More than half of them were female. This was preceded by what became to be known, starting in 1849, as the Earl Grey scheme, whose aim it was to select exclusively orphan girls from Irish workhouses and send them to New South Wales in Australia. Circa 3,500 famine orphans from Irish workhouses went to Port Jackson and Port Phillip between 1848 and 1850. That does not include the 600 who sailed into Port Adelaide. So there was 4,175 young Irish girls from ages of 14 upwards were sent. And Waterford City and the southeast of Ireland also sent their share of orphans. The Waterford News of 1849 reported that 25 pauper girls left the city on Tuesday for Australia. They were most tastefully and respectfully dressed. The newspaper reported that 18 pauper girls from the Callan Union Workhouse embarked for Dublin, and from there they went over to England and from there to Australia. In September of the same year, it was reported that this morning 23 orphans left this city, that's Waterford, by Bianconi's coach en route to Dublin. From thence they will sail tomorrow for Plymouth, where the Panama, that's a big orphan ship, awaits them to carry them and others to their destination. The newspaper also reported that the Vice Guardians of the New Ross Union also prepared 18 girls for the same destination. They will depart tomorrow. In May 1849, 20 young girls from Wexford Workhouse were sent off to Cape Town in South Africa. It was the first time that I came across anybody being sent to Africa from Ireland at that particular period, but indeed they were. Now, Most modern historians have stated that no girl was forced to emigrate. And indeed, I had an argument with an Australian historian about this. He said, oh, no. There was nobody sent over here against their will. They all agreed to go. However, we find in the proceedings of the Parliament of South Australia the following comment. I observe that when I enclosed a nominal list of 564 Irish female immigrants, of whom only 286 or little more than half asserted they had applied to be sent here. It seems that some girls were duped into accepting emigration. Letters were published to local newspapers all around the country, purporting to come from satisfied orphans, who not only thank the board for sending them to Australia, and they tell in glorious detail the benefits of emigration. The letters are remarkably well written, but not as remarkable as the letter writing skill applied to those letters by so-called unlettered orphans. Their literary quality and style suggest that the letters were written by well-educated professionals. It transpired that many, if not all, of the orphan girls were totally unsuitable for the position they were sent to. The fact that the poor girls in the workhouse, they didn't learn any skills whatsoever. They didn't know how to wash a cup, they didn't know how to make a bed, they didn't know how to sweep the floor. They were essentially feral children in the workhouse. There was a report by a fellow called Mr Savage from Sydney in 1852, describing the Irish orphan girls as amongst the choice servants in the fine houses of the colony, and saying a few thousand more would be the greatest boon the colony could receive. But the parliamentary report says quite the opposite. It says, when framing those sentences, the commissioners must have been well aware that in the intervening period they had received testimony entirely opposed to what they had adduced. Similar things had reached them as to the unproportioned, or the disproportion, I suppose we'd say, in modern language, of mostly Irish girls would be sent out. Girls were sent from Scotland, Wales and England, but the greater majority on the Earl Grey scheme actually were sent from Ireland. Now, they were essentially slave labour. Now, why do I say that? Because the Irish workhouse girls were further abused insofar as they did not receive the same wage rate as ordinary servants. This is stated in an inquiry held into Irish female immigration, which reads, these orphans were sent out with a charitable view at a season of peculiar want and affliction in Ireland, and were in fact forwarded to and accepted by the local government as apprentices to the vocation of domestic servants, and in pursuance were specifically indentured to employers at a much lower rate of wages than that ordinarily paid to servants. So it was, they were essentially working for half nothing. In the inquiry relating to Irish orphan girls in Australia in 1859, one sympathetic employer, when asked, and you think the case of the failure on the part of these girls, the blame was more on the part of the employers than on the part of the girls, to which the man replied, I think if they had been treated with any species of kindness, they would have turned out good and faithful servants. That's the whole lot of them. They only wanted instruction. In fact, you cannot get servants out in any shape. Not good servants. They all want instruction. However, there was worse to come for some of the orphan girls. Between 1849 and 1851, 244 girls were returned by their employers as not being competent. Some of the girls brought allegations of assault against their employer. Those girls were returned to a penitentiary, where instead of training girls for future employment, they were put to picking oakum, a penal task that they gave to convicts in jails. According to the inquiry, the girls, which amounted to 50 or 60, were confined in a locked room with very little ventilation. Excuse me. The room measured 100 foot long by 20 foot wide. There the ate, slept and drank. There was a yard of similar size where the girls exercised. The average age of the girls was between 16 and 18. The orphan girls had to endure these conditions, and some nuns of the Sisters of Charity visited them and appealed for them not to be kept in such conditions, but to no avail. In 1850, gold was discovered in Australia, and the Australian government sent to Ireland for some boys and girls and men and women to go over. However, at this stage, the famine had taken hold, and the United States Charter of Citizenship had thinned the ranks of those available to go, because a lot of people emigrated to the United States and to Canada during the famine. But it said in the newspaper, that's The Nation, they said, but there were comely lasses galore, fine, healthful, hopeful colleens graduating in their thousands in the pauper cells that cluster the land, that's Ireland, from Schull to Stranraer. And as the first female immigrants had given such satisfaction, both as domestics and wives, and in the colony of Victoria alone, the roll of bachelors amounted to the goodly number of 50,000, who only awaited the presence of many blushing, blooming maidens to cut the cords that bind them to domestic misery and forced celibacy. We are not surprised to find them beseeching His Grace and the Honourable Board to provide them with wives from amongst, listen to this, the blue-eyed workhouse girls of Munster and the raven-haired damsels of fair Connacht. It appears, as is suggested, that the purpose of these female immigrants was to be sexual fodder for the women-hungry Australian outbackers. Now, the bonds of marriage were not the only cords to bind the Irish workhouse girls. There was also the cords of prostitution. In a letter to a New South Wales newspaper, we find the following opinion of some of the Irish orphans. Is Eigse, that's his name is just initialed, aware that at the present time the streets of Sydney, Melbourne or Adelaide are swarming with strumpets who have been brought here from workhouses under the most heart-winning name of orphans? They're in a place in Adelaide called Red Light Square, devoted to the dwelling of the fallen of the fair sex. That place has been lately visited by the Orphan Immigration Board, and they have reported that the greater part of the females there are unfortunate creatures for whom AZ will enlist our sympathies. In a letter from Adelaide, dated 29th of October 1850, and published in The Fund for Promoting Female Immigration, it lauded the fact that so many English immigrants had found work. However, it also shone a light into the dark corners of the fate of many orphans whose profession became that of prostitute. The letter stated that, I am sorry to state, it is here, as in other populous towns, a description of persons ready to entrap the unwary. And I'm sorry to say it has been the case with a vast, emphasis on vast, number of the Irish orphans who have been sent out here and are pursuing a course of life that has placed them beyond the pale of society. In 1861, an Irish publication expresses in even stronger language the fate of many Irish workhouse girls. Can one of us imagine the feeling of an evicted tenant with the prospect of the workhouse before him for his wife and family? If he enters and keeps them there, his sons are doomed for the remainder of their lives to be dishonest beggars. His daughters, after living a few years of squalid misery in the poorhouse, will leave the place and become prostitutes. They will lead the lives of prostitutes and die the death of prostitutes. They will drown their wretchedness in drunkenness. They will wake the echoes of our streets with their midnight shrieks of despair. They will die of unnamed diseases in some splendid hospital. Such has been the fate of most all of our female children reared in Irish poorhouses. Indeed, at a very early age of the removal of Irish orphans, it was noted in a report from the Melbourne Orphan Board dated 26th of October 1849, the following passage, that the orphans by each succeeding ship had been disposed to parties of a lower rank and less desirable class than those preceding. Implicit in that statement is the suggestion that the welfare of the Irish orphans was at the best precarious and at the worst an entry into prostitution. However, the fate of the workhouse girls who remained in Ireland would have fared no better. And in the Waterford workhouse of 1856, there were 200 girls under the age of 15, many of them orphans. It was decided to teach the workhouse girls the art of muslin embroidery. As soon as the workhouse girls were able to earn 2 or 3 shillings each per week, they were let loose upon the town to do for themselves as best they could. The newspaper said, the ruin amongst them was awful. Many of them returned to the workhouse, fallen outcasts of society, some of whom confessed to the matron and chaplain that they had been seduced at so much per head by gentlemen of the city, all of whom moved in high life. At least one was in receipt of a large salary in Her Majesty's service. Some of the gentlemen used to boast of the number ruined. Another letter in the Waterford News describes the living conditions of these young girls. It reads, a small sum of money is advanced to support them by their employers. A few shillings that barely support nature until the next payday. Their supply of clothes for daily use is very light. Some of them are obliged to spend the night in old rooms without beds or bedclothes. They have no home. Many of them have no parent or even friend, save only such as create pity and charity. The letter writer suggests, all is wanted is to collect a few pounds and hire some rooms for these poor children of want. In the evidence taken before the Select Committee on Poor Relief in Ireland in 1861, a member of the Board of Guardians who remembered an instance of a girl who had been apprenticed out of the workhouse, detailing her experience while she was out. Her master, that's the person she was sent out to work for, had endeavoured to violate her, and she was sent back into the school and was found with a ring of children around her listening. The sexual abuse of the workhouse girls seems to have been constant and endemic. Now, the workhouse system could validly be viewed as, rather than an attempt to support the poor, as an attempt to punish poverty. The story of the labouring class of Waterford, and indeed Ireland, is a story of an attempt by one class to eradicate another class. The removal of both men and women from Ireland as indentured servants can only be viewed as class cleansing. Although the number of orphan girls removed from the Waterford workhouse was not too large, the intent and desire was to remove all paupers if possible. The following piece from the Waterford News of 1850 illustrates just that. The piece is entitled Good Move and reads, the Guardians of Dungarvan Union have resolved to send out 300 paupers to Quebec next June, and after some time they propose to send out 3 more. Would it not be well and a saving if all the able-bodied of every union were sent away? Now, some will argue that it was ethnic cleansing of the Irish. Others will disagree, but what was perpetrated on the destitute class of Ireland, and indeed England and Scotland, was most definitely class cleansing. The poor Irish in the early days of the Australian colonies felt themselves, this is from the newspaper, condemned to misery in this world and perdition in the next, dying unhoused, that's not having received the Eucharist, disappointed, unannaled, that's not having received extreme unction. But of course the Irish were always available, whether they agreed to it or not, to provide a platform of experimentation for the English. The following is from the Glasgow Chronicle of 1835 and proves just that. And it says, we understand there is a contemplation to send a few people of both sexes from the Emerald Isle for the purpose of raising a stock of free labourers of Irish extraction, born in the West Indian climate and inured to it, and who will be more likely to stand the climate than imported whites. So they just wanted to turn Paddy black. Aye. Again, what you don't read too much about when we're speaking about emigration to Australia and that is the mortality on the ships, the amount of people who died on the voyage. And in the Nation, it says, the mortality of the Australian emigration ships were described as fearful, and deaths were more common on the larger ships, such as those carrying 500 or 1,000 passengers. One ship, the Tincondra, which sailed from Liverpool in August 1852 with 800 emigrants. No less than 200 corpses were flung into the sea before she reached the quays of Melbourne. And the word dead was written opposite 3,000 names of the 50,000 who embarked for New South Wales and Victoria in the year before the end of the long voyage. In the returns, the native country of those who died are not given. However, as the nation caustically remarks, we are sure that the Irish, as usual, furnish their full quota of the bills of mortality. The number of deaths are frightful, considering the figures are only for a very short period. In the publication promoting emigration, none of this is mentioned, and the impression is given that the pats of Australia were littered with gold, but as the Irish emigrants soon found out, all that glitters is not gold. So Australia wasn't the only place that the Irish orphans were sent. They were also sent to Canada. In 1857, the Waterford News reported that 109 females of the Waterford Union will proceed from this port, that's Waterford, to Liverpool on their way to Quebec in Canada. In March 1863, the Waterford City Workhouse decided to send out 66 girls to Canada. A great friend of Thomas Francis Meagher was a young Irelander. His name was Thomas Darcy McGee, T.D. McGee was known as. And he escaped to Canada before Meagher and Mitchell and those were arrested and sent to Australia. So he became a member of the government in Canada. And in actual fact, in 1865, he was Immigration Minister for Canada. He wrote a scathing letter through the Irish newspapers directed at the Board of Guardians around the country regarding the incompetence of the Irish workhouse girls who were sent to Canada. He wrote, "Those unhappy girls are thrown on a strange soil without the commonest industrial training, without being fit for dairy or kitchen, without a knowledge of ironing, washing, plain sewing, or any description of common usefulness by which to make a decent living." He also laments the treatment meted out to the girls, either in the workhouse in Ireland or on board a ship while travelling to Canada. He continues, "But far worse remains, either before they have left Ireland or while on shipboard. Many of them have been subjected to temptations they have been unable to resist. We Irishmen in the colony," that's Canada, "proud amongst the few legacies left to us, is the matchless virtue of our countrywomen." And this is terrible. "We have been obliged to hang our heads in shame and to close our doors in the faces of the lost girls you send us out." Similarly, a Catholic clergyman writing from Kingston in Canada West wrote, "It would make your blood run cold to see them," that's the workhouse girls, "here from the boat that brings them, thrown on the quay without any protection, to go where they like, sometimes 300 at a time. You would see them going through the streets in flocks of 20 and 30, not knowing where to go. These creatures flock into every poor lodging house, not knowing but as into a house of ill repute they are trusting themselves." The Roman Catholic Bishop in Toronto, in a letter written to one of the Roman Catholic bishops in the north of Ireland and dated April 1864, in which he dwells upon the lamentable condition of the Irish immigrants, he said, How heartrending the sight of these emigrants arriving on our wharfs, surrounded by sharpers, the harpies of the city, destined to be swept like a torrent of rain into the sewers of our society. Hence the hospitals and poorhouses and jails and estates, to a great extent in Canada, have more than a proportion of inmates of Irish or their descendants. The emigrant ship, where all sexes are huddled together, break down the barriers of modesty and opens the path in thousands of cases to ruin. How many a tear has been dropped by those emigrants for ever having left their home. The bishop gives a touching description of the condition of the female emigrants. The workhouse system in Ireland is most degrading and immoral in its tendency. If the tree should be judged by its fruit, it's humiliating indeed to see the numbers of poor Irish girls, innocent and guileless, sitting around in those large depots of seaport cities waiting to be hired. Men and women enter those places and look around to find the girl, essentially to take her to a brothel. In 1865, a letter from the Immigration Office in Quebec stated that while on the subject of the Limerick girls, I may add that 2 of them returned here a few days ago barefoot and almost starving from the upper province, where unavailing efforts have been made by the agents to induce them to work and behave themselves respectably. There was a big problem with some of the Limerick girls that went out, as indeed there will with Belfast girls. Their personal appearance alone would, I imagine, under the most auspicious circumstances, deter any decent person from employing them. The fate of the Australian and Canadian workhouse girls was replicated by those who emigrated to the States, the United States. The following report from Harrington's debates, that's the House of Commons debates, in 1864 is shocking. One of the politicians said, "The honourable and learned gentleman has referred to the state of the Irish women in the United States, and there is no doubt a great deal of harrowing truth in the letter he read. It is too true, I fear, that there are thousands of these poor, deserted Irish girls who are gaining a precarious livelihood by vice and other unhappy means." And it continues, I have here a statement copied from the Cork Daily Reporter and taken from the most authentic source, that there are no less than 30,000 Irish females who have left home and friends and are now walking the streets of New York friendless and deserted. Now, while there is no suggestion that all of these girls were workhouse girls, again, they almost certainly fill the quota of the abandoned. There is no suggestion that if these women remained in Ireland, they would not find themselves on the streets, as in 1851, there were in Dublin 248 brothels, 299 houses occupied or frequented by prostitutes. The total number of these unfortunates, this is Dublin we're talking about now, is 1,170. However, the pleas of T.D. McGee and others not to export any more workhouse girls fell on deaf ears, and we find that in 1882 to 1883, the Freeman's Journal reported that 220 workhouse inmates sailed from Foynes to the United States. 70 from Ennis Workhouse and 150 from Glynn Workhouse. Indeed, one but has to look at the American newspapers of the period to see how many hundreds of workhouse females, males and children, being shipped to the United States. It's just absolutely dreadful. It's a part of our history that we never knew, and how I came to find out about it, quite simply, is that I have a good friend in Canada. Speaking to him one day, he just mentioned that a good friend of his had died, and he was the man who had the monument to the Irish Workhouse Orphans erected. I think it's in Melbourne, and that was the first. And I said, what orphans? And he wanted to give me a brief description of the monument, and from that then I went on to look at the newspapers and the parliamentary reports, do a bit of research on it, and it's indeed frightful. A lot of people don't like to listen to this history, and indeed I was doing a couple of gigs in a place in the city, which I won't mention, and I was singing songs, and I was given a talk, and I mentioned about the aspect of the orphans, and there was two people there from Canada who had never heard anything about the orphans, and both of them were women. They began to cry, and I was complained that night, not by the Canadians, not by the English, not by the Americans, but by two people from Fáilte, Ireland. They just wanted the sanitised version of Irish history, of leprechauns and the lords and ladies, don't you know. To conclude, the workhouse, with its punitive regimes such as the separation of families, stone breaking, sentences on the treadmill and the capstan mill, only enabled the poor to live a life of drudgery and imprisonment. The most constant diet was that of misery. It would appear that the main consideration for the boards of guards was to reduce the amount of poor rates on their respective unions, and not necessarily the welfare of the workhouse girls. In a piece in the Freeman's Journal of 1851 entitled Wholesale Immigration, Mr Minute, one of the guardians of the Nina Union in Tipperary, gave notice of his intention to move for a loan sufficient to enable the board to sell 12,000 paupers away. Now, a lot of these numbers you'll see, especially these large numbers, never in actual fact happened. But the only thing prevented it from happening was access to funds. The poor law was portrayed as an exercise in social conscience and charity. However, it soon transpired that it was often oppression, racism, imprisonment, and power masquerading as charity. The attitude of the Board of Guards, who were drawn mainly from the property class and clergy, carried the prejudice of that class towards the destitute. The behaviour, poverty, and excesses of the poor were often perceived and described as savagery. But if it was savagery, the destitute were furnished with all the ingredients to turn them into savages by the very class who now frowned upon that savagery. Some clergy were also conflicted in their religious obligations to the poor and their class prejudice against them. This is borne out in a report of Lieutenant Downman, Inspecting Officer, County Waterford, for weekend in the 27th of February 1847, when he writes, "The priests and farmers," that's the big farmers, "the priests and farmers are very troublesome," this is in Waterford, "recommending all their own friends and caring what little that becomes of the destitute." And we can trace that attitude right back from the 19th century, right into the 20th century, an attitude which has given and seen the abuse of many of our children and women. And it gave rise to the many abuse inquiries and tribunals. I do hope you enjoyed the little talk on that. It can be harrowing at times, and it can make you very angry when you're reading all these reports. And I feel, since I began this task of looking into this, I feel as if there was one voice saying, you know, please tell my story. And it has developed into a crescendo of thousands of voices from the past just saying to me, please tell our story. I hope I've started to tell a story here tonight. So thank you very much for your company.